Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. Tonight I'd like to show you an astounding Poe artifact of great historical value. But I can't, because it no longer exists. But we'll find out what it was and where it went on tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. Well, first of all, there's a lot more Poe artifacts that don't exist than do exist. Over the years, most of his possessions have been discarded or lost, including that greatcoat you see him wearing the different daguerreotypes. That was discarded back in the 1930s in New York somewhere. Or how about the buffalo robe, in which Poe's foster parents used to wrap him when they went for carriage rides in the winter? That was thrown out in the 1970s. But the artifact I'd like to tell you about is Poe's mother-in-law, Maria Clemm's trunk. And I'm telling you about this because even though we don't have the item anymore, we have some of the stuff from it. Like these are Poe's mother-in-law's stockings. Take a look, that's got kind of a spider web pattern sewn into it there. And I know a textile conservator who really likes to smell old fabric, so I'll tell you what this smells like. It doesn't smell like anything. Or how about here? This is Poe's mother-in-law's cap. And it probably even has some of her hair still in it. So Poe's mother-in-law, Maria Clemm, was Edgar Allan Poe's biological father's sister. So that does mean he married his first cousin, but we already know that. But we don't really get the full story of what happened to her after Edgar Allan Poe died. You see, she was a widow. She had nowhere else to go after he died, so she ended up bouncing around from city to city, living in Lowell with Poe's friend Annie Richmond for a while, in New York with Stella Lewis, and then with Marie Louise Shue. She lived in Baltimore with different relatives there, even went to Alexandria, Virginia, lived for a while, and had plans to move to New Orleans, but that never quite worked out. In the meanwhile, she kept her possessions in a little trunk that she carried around with her. She finally ended up in a charity home in Baltimore, which by strange coincidence used to be the hospital in which Edgar Allan Poe had died back in 1849, over 2 decades earlier. So they both ended up dying in the same building, and now they're buried next to each other, not too far away at the Westminster Burying Grounds. So in this time, she started writing to her nieces, her sister Elizabeth, Poe Herring's daughters, Elizabeth, who was the inspiration for Poe's poem Elizabeth, and her sister Emily. And she kept them up on updates on what life was like there and how rough it was for her. And finally, before she died, she left her trunk to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, in turn, passed it down to her daughter. And we'll pick up the story with her granddaughter. So Elizabeth Herring's great-granddaughter, Antoinette Smith Suter. And she was 14 years old at the time. It was 1938. And she remembers visiting her grandmother. Her grandmother would take this trunk off a shelf in a hall closet once a year and show it to all the friends at her afternoon tea. She'd say, "This is your cousin Eddie's vest. These are your cousin Eddie's socks. This is your Auntie Clemm's cap. And these are your Auntie Clemm's stockings." And then each year she would dutifully put the pieces back in the trunk, put the trunk back on the shelf in the hall closet, and you wouldn't see these things for another year. These were cherished family heirlooms. But for whatever reason, in 1938, the grandmother didn't put these pieces back in the trunk. She put the trunk back in the hall closet, put it on its shelf, but then she laid out the stockings, Edgar's stockings, Maria Clemm's stockings, and the waistcoat and the cap on another shelf, and then she died. And her husband, he wasn't a sentimental type. He just called up the thrift store and said, I've got a bunch of old junk, old clothes and stuff. I need you to get it out of here. So they just came and they started hauling out priceless family heirlooms. And meanwhile, 6 hours away, Antoinette and her mother heard that they were just throwing out all these Poe pieces. So they raced 6 hours to get to the house just in time to rescue Maria Clemm's stockings, the cap, the waistcoat, but they didn't make it in time for the trunk. And we have no idea what else is in this. We know that people knew about this as early as 1920s. Poe collector and co-founder of the Poe Museum, James H. Whitty, started writing Antoinette's grandmother asking, what's in the trunk? Can I buy what's in the trunk? And Antoinette herself, talking 60 years later, she didn't remember exactly what else was in the trunk, but she remembered there were some old papers and things. Could these be old Poe letters? Or maybe an unfinished Poe manuscript? So we don't know what else was in the trunk. We do know that Maria Clemm held on to different relics of her famous son and her daughter Virginia, Edgar's wife. And she gave away different pieces over the years, like Edgar Allan Poe's mustache scissors and his pocket comb. And she also mentions that she had a gold watch of his that she owned, not the one that we have, but one that he had towards the end of his life. But maybe they also had Poe's pants in there. We have his waistcoat, we have his socks, but we don't have any pants. Where's the rest of his outfit? Maybe that was in the trunk. Maybe the cravat he used to wear. Or what about Virginia Poe's things? Well, we know that there's a trinket box of hers that's been passed down through the family. There's a little miniature drinking glass. So what other things could there have been in this trunk? Maybe her comb, or maybe some of her mercury-based medicines or lead-based makeup powders. Who knows? The pieces end up at a thrift shop, and from there, who knows what happened to them? Somebody else could have been walking down the street dressed up in Poe's pants with no idea whatsoever. The pants got worn out, they probably tossed them in the trash. Or maybe somebody found some of those papers, realized what they were, and they're still out there somewhere. What we do know about the trunk is that Antoinette Suter described it as being a small trunk, so not nearly as big as Edgar Allan Poe's trunk that we have on display here at the museum. And of course, it would have been small enough that it could fit on a shelf in a hall closet. We don't have much more of a description than that. But fortunately, Antoinette Suter, about 60 years later, donated the Poe clothing and Maria Clemm's clothing from the trunk to the Poe Museum, where you can see Poe's waistcoat and socks on display right now, but you probably can't see Maria Clemm's stockings. They're so big we didn't have a good place to display them. So at least you get to virtually see them here. So what do you think was in the trunk? And are there any other missing Poe artifacts that you'd really like us to track down? Let us know down in the comments what you think. And if you just happen to have any Poe mementos like Edgar Allan Poe's mustache scissors, don't throw them in the trash or give them to a thrift shop. Donate them to the Poe Museum. And if you don't have Poe's mustache scissors, you can still be part of the Poe team by becoming a member or making a contribution at poemuseum.org. And until next time, thanks for joining us. And here's a little something for our feline viewership.